Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Rogue Health Economist. Today we are going to talk about resilience and anti-fragility. You know, at the Evolution of Medicine last year, we had come up with a new word each year for our word of the year. Last year it was group and group visits, and we focused on building the rationale for group visits through a series of podcasts. I wrote a book called The Community Cure, and we put a lot of emphasis into making it easy for doctors all around the world to start to implement functional medicine group visits. And this year we came up with the word of the year to be resilience. And hasn't it become a super important word for this year for so many reasons? Now today, what I want to talk about is resilience in the face of COVID-18. Now, one of the things we've talked about is creating resilient humans. And if you go back over the episodes this week, we'll talk about our goals of creating individual resilience, family resilience, community resilience, national resilience, and then further to that, international resilience as a species. But I want to get into a slightly different conversation today, and I want to share with you a little bit about some thoughts that I've had about what it truly means to be resilient, and is there another level beyond resilience? Obviously, for the medical practitioners who are watching, the whole point of the virtual practice pivot interactive guide is to allow you to have a totally resilient medical practice. Those doctors that have followed our ideas at the Evolution of Medicine have a low overhead, digital first medical practice and are up and running and thriving in a time where most medical practices, primary care, and and functional medicine and family medicine are out of business. But I want to introduce a new concept today, and that is the term anti-fragility. And you may think that fragile and resilience are opposites, but this book called Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb really shared with me something very different that occurs in nature. And he says, anti-fragility is beyond resilience or robustness. The resilient resists shocks and stays the same. The anti-fragile gets better. And I think this is such an important conversation for us here at the Rogue Health Economist, because, you know, we do need resilient people, and we need to raise the resilience for future health threats like future pandemics. But ultimately, you know, we have to say to ourselves, it's like things weren't necessarily going that well. Right? It wasn't like we had a vastly healthy population and we were moving in the right direction. I've shared over the last few events that for the first time in human history, there was a sustained decrease in the life expectancy of Americans due to a number of things, but one of them being the opiate crisis. There was a number of factors that contribute to that. And so there's these underlying factors that are leading to real problems in our healthcare system. And so just making ourselves more resilient may be not the sort of end goal that we should be aiming for. You know, could this crisis, could this stressor knock us into a different kind of action in the future? Could this crisis really kickstart a movement towards not just resilience, but actually a much stronger and healthier community beyond just being more resilient to become anti-fragile? And I wanted to give you a context for that and what I think could be possible. And so just to lay the foundation for that, I want to share my friend, Dr. Asim Malhotra, was featured this week on the BBC talking about one of the problems that we have faced as society, what's it causing in the COVID era, and what we should maybe be thinking about doing about it. Check it out.
Their sickest patients are those under 60 who are obese. Well, one of the doctors making those warnings is Asim Malhotra, a consultant cardiologist from London, who joins us live, as you can see. Thank you so much for being here with me. So tell me, in terms of what you've seen, how much of a difference does obese actually make it in terms of the fatality figures that we're seeing?
Well, it's a huge problem, actually. So looking and having analysed all the data, looking at data from the CDC, from Centers of Disease Control, it appears that obesity and more specifically diseases associated with a metabolic syndrome, which I'll explain in a second, are associated with a 10-fold increase in mortality. We know obesity alone in the under 60s is the single biggest risk factor. But I think what's really important to highlight here is what is the root cause of that. Now, prior to COVID-19, it is well known, it's well established in the medical literature that poor diet is responsible globally for more disease and death than physical inactivity, smoking, and alcohol combined. Specifically, 11 million deaths a year globally are attributed specifically to poor diet. Now, when one looks at what's happened with COVID-19, it's very clear that the biggest risk factor for all of these problems, obesity and these conditions such as type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure leading to heart disease, are all rooted in poor diet. Now, what I have emphasized, and I wrote about this in the Telegraph newspaper today in an article that got mentioned and featured on the front page, is that actually the time is now for government and Public Health England to be telling the public to change their diet. And the reason for that is that we know that, and this is something I see with my patients all the time, many clinicians around the country are doing this as part of a lifestyle prescription. You can reverse many of these conditions, send them into remission, certainly massively improve those risk factors within the space of just a few weeks of people cutting out the biggest sort of problem in our diet at the moment.
Well, I was going to ask you about that moving forward, and I'll come back to that in a moment or two. But I mean, that line that you just said there of a tenfold increase in mortality rates is a shocking, shocking figure. Is that what you're seeing globally, internationally, not just here in the UK? And do you know medically why it would be so high?
Yeah, it's very good question. So all of the data from CDC has identified this tenfold increased risk with these conditions like type 2 diabetes and the ones we've mentioned earlier, which again are rooted in poor diet. So the reason for that, which is a very good question for you to ask, is twofold. One is excess body fat, and we know this from previous flu data. Excess body fat is thought to cause a dysregulated immune system. In other words, the immune system doesn't function optimally, and when you get infections like the flu, you're more likely to die from conditions like acute, respiratory distress syndrome, which is what kills people with COVID-19. So that's one of the mechanisms. The other mechanism is that if you eat too much ultra-processed food, even if you're normal weight, by the way, so this affects people even with normal weight, then your body is chronically getting mildly damaged, and that results in a process called chronic inflammation. Now, it appears that when you have an acute infection on top of that from COVID-19, the combination of the excess body fat and the chronic inflammation seems to be particularly detrimental.
And I take it from the tail end of your first answer that you don't think it's too late for individuals to change their behaviour and not too late for the government also to pivot in terms of advice.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right there. So I see with my own patients, and this is well established in the literature, that you can reverse these risk factors within a few weeks of just cutting out ultra-processed food, starch and sugary foods in particular. People will lose weight, but even if they don't lose weight, they're improving their health markers quite dramatically. That's the first thing. The second thing is you're absolutely right. Actually, what should be coming from the government now, they've been very effective in getting people to stay home with the message about stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives. I think actually we need to add on to that, eat real food, protect the NHS and save lives. But also, as well as individuals improving, what really needs to happen is we need to tackle the root cause of this poor diet, which is the food environment. I mean, more than 50% of the British diet now is ultra-processed foods, essentially mass-packaged foods. It's nutrient deficient, that is high in unhealthy oils, sugar and starch, and is now more than 50% of the diet. It's actually such a problem that it's even infiltrated our hospitals. So 75% of foods purchased in hospitals are unhealthy, these sorts of foods. And it's no surprise that, unfortunately, NHS workers are also afflicted with diet-related disease as well.
Aseem Malhotra, we've run out of time, but thanks so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is a big deal, right? Obviously, he's talking about the NHS in the UK, but it's the same in every industrialized country. The first data that came out was actually from Italy, where 99% of other people had some sort of comorbidity. It's similar here in America. And as Dr. Malhotra said, a tenfold increase in risk. Now, one, could this be the stressor that changes that? Because the obesity rates in America have continued to go higher and higher and higher and higher at the moment, over time. So how are we going to flatten those curves, right? If we're talking about flattening the curve of healthcare costs, we need to get that number to come down. And so, one of the things that Dr. Malhotra said that I completely agree with, and this was something that was brought up in Charles Eisenstein's epic essay, The Coronation, was really like, we see during this crisis moment that we're able to radically change behavior, right? Everyone stays at home, no one really questions it. And especially in the UK, we're able to change behavior like that. And could we use this opportunity to do exactly the same thing, where we could actually use this opportunity to get people to participate in their health in a new way? And I think there are, signs that potentially that could happen. He mentioned the food environment. And one of the things that's really interesting is that for most people, if you look at someone like Dr. Mark Hyman's work, his book came out just before COVID called Food Fix. And one of the biggest fixes he said for the food system was people have to learn to cook at home, right? We can't all be eating out all the time because those highly processed ingredients end up in food in restaurants and chains. And, we don't have nearly as much control about what goes into our food. And so ultimately at this moment, we do see the vast majority of people starting to cook a lot more meals at home. So whatever the reason for this shock is, whatever just happened, right? You can see that, Dr. Mark Hyman 2 months ago was talking about everyone eating at home, and now everyone's eating at home, right? And everyone's, having to cook to a certain degree. And so I just think it's a really interesting moment. Like, could we come back anti-fragile? Like, could this stress come along, and rather than just being more resilient, could we have a much more a community that improves? And these kind of things only happen in nature, right? Where a stress happens, like if you have any, in the book, he talks a lot about how if you take things like metal and glass and things that are, resilient, they don't get better under pressure. But it is natural systems that do get better under pressure because that stress actually causes them to improve. And one of these things is the immune system, right? The immune system is created. Why do kids put everything in their mouth? Is because they're training the immune system to build immune resilience to things in the environment. And one of the things about being inside and not being in nature, not being outside, is that we're actually reducing the potential. So if you're asking me for my ideas, and it's my show, so I get to share my ideas, the only way that we will actually achieve this is through community. And the reason why is because it's very difficult to change those kind of behaviors by ourselves. And next week, our whole week is going to be on community, and we're going to be speaking to people who have a real interesting insights on community. And we're going to be talking about all aspects to do with community, because I wrote a book that came out in January called The Community Cure. And essentially in that book argued for the fact that lifestyle-driven chronic disease is much more similar to alcoholism than it is to getting an infection. And we all know what we do for alcoholics. We provide them with support and accountability, and not drugs and doctors. As an example, my mother-in-law, she goes to Overeaters Anonymous and lost 100 pounds once through the only one change, which was having an accountability buddy that she had to report what she ate every day. And that caused such a dramatic shift in her thinking process that she was able to make that kind of a shift. And that's the power of this peer-to-peer dynamic that is used nowhere in medicine. And that, I believe, is one of the fundamentals that we have to engage in order to get this decrease in healthcare costs. So is this moment a moment of anti-fragility for you and your family? Are you healthier as a result of this, or are you less healthy? And ultimately, there have been, for some people, this experience has been very different for different people. But ultimately, I think that many other people think that this could be a moment where a stressor causes a dramatic shift in the underlying way that we take care of ourselves and that we take care of each other. And if we're learning nothing from being isolated, it's that we need each other. And you can feel that feeling coming out in many different ways in society. So I'd love to hear what you think about this. If you think this is a message you can get behind, I'd love to see you share this video. If you have comments, please comment in the links below and we can talk more about it. Super excited to be coming to you every day at 12 o'clock at facebook.com/Rogue Health Economist. And we will be next week talking all about community. Tomorrow, I'm going to share with you my thesis for healthcare transformation and how do we help these curves to go down, and what it's going to take to do that. It's been a wonderful time to be here with you. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.